Hello, I'm Chuck Wolf, Chief Executive for Charles J. Wolf Associates, LLC. As a motivational speaker and a leadership consultant and executive coach and trainer, I often work with very successful people in their companies. Since many can't afford a professional, I volunteer to host a radio talk show called The Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel, on a nonprofit community radio station in Bridgeport, Connecticut, WPKN. My reason for doing the show is to share with as many people as possible this wonderful process for helping people manage their own emotions and their relationships with others. My goal is for everyone listening to learn to use the Emotion Roadmap to make life better. As you listen to me, help others, I hope you are also learning. As a Simsbury resident, I'm delighted to be able to make the show available through Simsbury TV. To learn more, go to my website, www.emotionroadmap.com. Thank you for listening and watching.
You're listening to WPKN 89.5 FM in Bridgeport, Connecticut. This is Chuck Wolf. The show is The Emotion Roadmap. Take the wheel and control how you feel. And I'm delighted today that I have a guest speaker who I've gotten to know and really admire, Richard Boyatzis. And you can actually look his name up, Boyatzis. And I'm going to ask Richard to tell you a little bit about himself. But I can tell you that I first got to know something about Richard when he wrote a book a long time ago called The Competent Manager, and it was fascinating because it really created a rush for all kinds of organizations to begin to look and think about the idea that there are particular competencies that are really relevant for people's ability to perform at high levels. And that was when I first began to notice what Richard was doing and working on. And then I've gotten to know him more recently in recent years in the field of emotional intelligence. And Richard's one of the leading thinkers and writers in this field. And we're going to be talking about all of that and as it relates to his new book, Helping People Change. And it's a book that's about to come out. So I'm going to ask you now, Richard, if you just say something about how you came to write this book. And your background to me is really fascinating because you didn't start off as a psychologist, but you ended up there. So if you could give my listeners just a little bit of idea of how you ended up where you are today and what you're doing and why this book is important to you.
Sure. Thanks, Chuck. My parents immigrated from Greece. I grew up in New York City, and the public schools at PS 150 had decided I was cognitively slow and tried to leave me back 3 times.
Wow. That's unbelievable.
Having a Greek accent, which in 1950 was seen as, if you had a foreign accent, it was considered slow. Lo and behold, a number of years later, Sputnik goes up, they retest everybody, and I test really strongly in math and physics. So they made an offer to my mother and father that I either skip a few years or go into an advanced program, and they chose the advanced program. But all of that spoke to the issue that I wanted to be in the space program. And because I was, and according to my wife still am, very nerdy, I ended up going to MIT and majoring in aeronautics and astronautics. My focus really was control systems of interplanetary vehicles. But because, my father was a waiter and worked hard, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, he didn't have much money to help me out, so I was putting myself through school. And I was running out of money and options around scholarships and loans and all that. So MIT got me a job in a research lab at Northrop Norrair. So in August of 66 through February of 67, I worked in the Experimental Gas Dynamics Research Lab at Northrop Norrair. And the main job I was on was helping design control systems, surfaces for what was being proposed as the reusable booster.
Let me stop you for a second just to say that that's not the typical background of a psychologist or someone that does this kind of work. That's why I find it so fascinating.
But what happened was I found out that the day-to-day work was really boring. You write computer programs, you estimate these things, you design them, you test them in a lab, and it is different than the momentary excitement of being able to, kind of spend all the years preparing and going into space. Anyway, so I just decided that was it. I couldn't stand it. But I only had 2 courses left, and I'm much too compulsive not to finish. So I went back to MIT and finished, but in the process, I said, what the hell am I going to do? And then it dawned on me that I didn't want to be an engineer. I didn't want to go into the restaurant business like my father and all my uncles and cousins in New York. So I said, okay, I'll go into management. It's got to be easy because these idiots, these professionals we had as managers, here they had two departments of, Sheldons, basically, from Big Bang Theory. And I thought they got very little out of us. And most of the chatter and what people did was, kind of sub-optimize to just get through. And then occasionally you get excited by something, but nobody helped you in that way. So I signed up for a management course at MIT. And in the process, I said to then a fairly young, just finishing his doctorate, David Kolb, who is my faculty member, that I wanted to do my paper for the course on how managers don't help subordinates. And he said, well, I've got one different proposal for you. We just finished 3 weeks ago collecting almost 2 years, a year and a half's worth of data on how MIT graduate students in their version of the MBA program help or don't help each other. It's not exactly the manager situation, but they are all, around 29 or 30, and they're all going to be managers. I said, sure. I dove into it, did all the, not all, but I did a lot of the analytic, stuff, and he liked what I was coming up with. They offered me a job for the summer. And that led to me getting to know a bunch of people who at the time I didn't know were, kind of titans in the field, like Ed Schein and in terms of process consultation and OD, and Everett Hagen and psychoanalytic history, and Dave McClellan on social change, and Carl Swanson and Jack Pugh and the guys at the Systems Dynamics Lab at MIT. This is about 20 years before Peter Senge showed up. So what basically happened is they got me into doctoral courses, and I discovered this field that I never knew existed called psychology, and I loved it. And it just dawned on me that I didn't know anybody personally from my upbringing that would continue to work whether they got paid or not. But all of a sudden I found this so compelling, both the topics and the whole thing about working with people, that it drew me into it. And the next thing I know, these individuals helped me get into the PhD program in psychology at Harvard.
You've listed for people that don't know, like a hall of fame of people that are famous in their fields, respectively, and going from organization development and other areas. So I think that, I just want to mention that for people that don't know the names, and that's fascinating too.
Yeah, I mean, like Everett Hagen formed the Psychoanalytic Historical Society with Eric Erikson.
Wow.
So for those people who might remember from their undergraduate years, reading Young Man Luther or Gandhi's Truth, or that whole thing about using psychoanalytic theory to reconstruct people's histories, was very powerful. But anyway, so here I am, and we ended up publishing that paper. And so it is true to say that I began my career in psychology in 1967 working on helping relationships. And in fact, after a number of different papers that came out of this research and then some additional stuff Dave Kolb and I were doing. So while I was at Harvard, I was also still working on research with him at MIT. That really was the beginning. And in fact, we even wrote a whole book on helping relationships, but couldn't find anybody willing to publish it. So we just let it go by the wayside. So throughout my life in this field, I've been fascinated by how do people help others, whether it's learn or change or whatever. And then around 1970, I started doing two things in parallel. One was my thesis advisor and I were doing some continuing research based on earlier stuff that he had done on why men drank abusively. And I developed a therapy program. So I started doing the group therapy program and training therapists at the VA in Brockton, Mass. And that was 1970, and the feds picked it up, and all of a sudden had me training psychologists in 5 cities around the country, then 15, and how to use this group therapy technique as a way to supplement AA and medical treatment. And part of what I designed into this program was based on this theory that Kolb and I had been working on, which was the forerunner of my intentional change theory. Back then we called it self-directed behavior change. The thing I was started in parallel was, if you don't take alcoholics and drug addicts, but you take quote-unquote normal people, and you say, okay, how are we helping them learn or change? You immediately get posed the question, change what? And that led me into the research on the competencies. And I did the first empirical study against performance in 1970. But some people claim that I'm one of the 4 people who started the whole competency movement in human resources. Dave McClellan and myself here in Boston, and then Marv Dennett and one of his key fellows, doctoral students out in Minneapolis. But what happened was, I spent a good deal of time in the 70s seeing how these approaches to helping others would work, and trying to apply what I now call an intentional change theory to working with alcoholics and drug addicts. But one of the things that happens when you spend a lot of time with therapists and doing group therapy, it's in the dictionary, it's kind of depressing.
Sure.
I mean, even if you're better than most, you still have a 60% recidivism rate, and an awful lot of people end up, killing themselves, and hopefully not taking other people with them. So by the late 70s, I said, okay, I've got to edge out of this, and I started, getting some research contracts to develop diagnostic systems and, more analytic things. But it was the competency work that it had been cooking along there at a prodigious rate. And that's what led to my 82 book, which was, of all of the research out there, people had been, in the psychological literature or management literature, had been relating a particular trait against performance, but nobody had looked at a comprehensive set of characteristics other than personality theory against performance. So here we were contemplating this characteristic called a competency, which is, a set of skills organized around an unconscious intent. And that, all of a sudden we're sitting on, not all of a sudden, but after quite a few years, we're sitting on data from, 6 major corporations and 6 major federal agencies for all these different levels. So I dove into that and generated the research book. And in the process, no sooner had I was getting close to finishing that when, of course, the issue that was coming up, and here we were in my former research company in Boston, helping the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps and helping most of the federal agencies with leadership development, and at the same time, a lot of major corporations. But the question kept coming back to, how are you helping them get there? And at the time, as I felt, because it was a part of Kolb's and my original theory, that the ideal self, this sense of who you would love to be, what you would love to become, what we later have termed, the personal vision, was key. But at the time, I always thought, in my kind of key engineering mentality, that somehow was the gap between that and how you actually act that was the, motivating force for change. In 87, I got kind of tired of running the 2 consulting companies. I'd done that for 11 years, and, they'd both grown considerably. And so I decided it was time for me to move on. And that's when I accepted a tenured position at Case Western Reserve as a professor, and started with the absolute focus of, could we help the 25 to 65-year-olds in our executive programs, from MBA programs on up, change? And I had been a part of doing research in the 80s and into the early 90s for the group that accredits business schools, showing that it was abysmal as to how little people changed as a result of management education. later on, the Consortium for Research on Emotional Intelligence, of which you're a part, and that's how you and I meet twice a year and catch up,
Right.
ended up documenting that it was just as abysmal when you look at training programs in government or industry. So that sparked a challenge for me. I had this sense that we had a number of ideas as to what could really unleash people's own desire for change, not what somebody else is telling them to do. And that's all of a sudden what dawned on me as to why all of those weeks I spent in leadership programs or management programs or training human resource people all over the world, that it always felt like if you could reach a third of the people, you were lucky. Well, the problem was that companies or government agencies were sending people to these programs. And that really struck a note for me. So beginning in 1989 and 90, we had created an MBA course and then started using variations of it for other graduate programs and now even undergraduate, where we decided to, I say a group of us, but my intentional change theory is driving it, to drive the whole experience about a person's vision for themselves, their ideal self. And the course that we ended up developing did something a little different, or a lot different than almost everybody else. Almost everybody at that time, 1989-90, did the data dumps. You know, you do 2.5 days of an assessment center, then you sit down with, a coach, and you get all your data feedback, and in a few hours, and they say, okay, what do you want to do about it? Or you go to management training, and they give you all sorts of either simulations or assessments. You get all the data back, and somebody says, okay, look at the gaps. What do you want to change? And it just struck me that was backwards, that somehow we were assuming that people wanted to change on these things or improve, when in fact, a lot of people were just going to bide their time or, check a box. So as we began and focused on the vision, and then had the assessments in the middle part and then a learning plan toward the end, we also started a whole bunch of research studies. And to date, we've done 39 longitudinal studies showing that, yes, we can help 25 to 65-year-olds significantly develop their, what we'd call the emotional and social intelligence competencies, the behavior, not traits, but the behavior, as seen by others or coded off of videos of their behavior. And that improvement comes in at a rocking 62% in the first year to two, compared to above average MBA programs that do 2%, or the best government or industry training programs that do about 11%. And usually all of these impacts drop off dramatically. It's called the honeymoon effect. 3 weeks, 3 months, you're trying, and then it goes like New Year's Eve resolutions. But we weren't getting that. Ours did drop a bit, but leveled off at a 50% improvement 5 to 7 years later as we did follow-up studies.
Let me stop you for a second, Richard, and just make a couple of comments. One is for about 2 years, I worked in the executive program for management development at Harvard Business School. And during that time, the professor I worked for, a fellow named Tony Athos.
I remember Tony.
Yeah, Tony was like the most amazing person I ever met and worked with. But anyway, he had me do a study. It was never published, but he just wanted to know from the people that had gone. This is this 9-month program that executives, these are not graduate students so much as they are people coming from industry or other kinds of organizations. In fact, a lot of Chinese people were going there. It was the 1980s. Couldn't speak the language, but they were certainly willing to work hard. But anyway, he asked me to write to all the executives that he had over the last couple of years that he had been doing this, and ask them what did they learn and what did they remember We put together a series of questions, and one of the things that was so relevant in terms of what we got back for information was one person's comment that sort of was a theme that ran throughout it. But this person said, for me, it was like the flowers of Algernon, and the movie of a man who was...
Oh, I remember it, yeah.
Remember? Yeah. So somebody who was retarded at the time. But anyway, somebody who got great knowledge through some kind of drug and some potency of a chemical reaction in his brain seemed to trigger his intellectual abilities, but then he began to lose it. And after being this brilliant person, he felt himself returning to what he had been before. And that's how this person described what happened after he went back to work in this executive program, where he felt he had been so brilliantly educated by these professors at Harvard. And then when he went back to work, this was sort of a key also, if he went back to his old job, and he didn't really have the opportunity to use all these new skills. So if he was like the head of finance, for instance, but he didn't have all this general management learning that took place around strategy and operations and around organization behavior and so forth, he just didn't get to use it, and he felt himself like losing all of this gradually, and he felt horrible about it. But it was an amazing experience. He loved the experience, but he felt that maybe if I had gone into a new role, and this is sort of what you're saying, if somebody knew that they were motivated because they had this chance to be the general manager or the head of a division or something, and they're going to use all these skills that they were learning, and they got to embrace them, at least to me, that was more, it wasn't about compliance, it was about compassion at that point. That's how I heard it.
Well, we see, the only thing that could have improved it is if you and Tony had gone ahead and interviewed people who worked around those individuals about those individuals. And my contention is that if you had done that, you would have found that they lost it 3 weeks to 3 months after the program ended. And, and that's after a Harvard Business School, which, had some very, very dramatic faculty. And one of the things that Tony did, as you know, is he really believes in going deep inside.
Right.
And he was, a part of a group that even a few of them did some lay and psychoanalytic work, and Harry Levinson was hanging around there, and a few others, that it ended up creating a sense that the internal is very, very important. In fact, today his work would be called either emotional self-awareness or mindfulness, as we use today's jargon.
Right. Hey, there's one other thing I want to say to you, though. As I was reading through your book, which I really enjoyed, I found lots of case studies that were very interesting. And then one of the things that struck me, and why I asked you to start by talking about your own background, is it seems to me that you were a case study in terms of your own vision, starting off as a physics and an engineer, and then look where you've gotten to. And it seems to me you're a kind of living example, a living proof of your own model.
Well, and I remember saying this to Warren Bennis, who, was a key friend and supporter throughout my career. When he had finished his autobiography, I saw him. We were both keynoting on some conference a couple weeks later, and I commended him on his, not only, which I'd known, his marvelous history, from the Battle of the Bulge to president of universities, but also pointed out to him that I thought it was powerful to contemplate telling our story, not in terms of what we've accomplished, but who helped us along the way. So for me, personally, it was my mother's grit that got me through all these battles with the public school systems. It was my father's continued reverence for higher education. And then it was, people like Dave Kolb and, Max Boyson, in my physics teacher in high school, just ended up creating curiosity in me. And then Dave Kolb ended up helping guide me into this new field. And then others like Dave McClellan and Ed Schein decided that even though I couldn't put a sentence together, that I had some promise if I was talking, not writing. So, yes, I think it continues to be that saga. But, again, if I jump all the way to now,
right?
Actually, not now, but somewhere around 2006, 2003, it dawned on me that, and I've been tracking a lot of hormonal physiological data from my days when I was doing basic research on the effects of alcohol on aggression and what it did in terms of blood samples and all this kind of stuff, that it was time to understand what was going on in the brain. The one part of my whole change process that we knew the least about was what I call Discovery 5, which is building these resonant, caring relationships with people who help you. Sometimes we use a shorthand and say it's like people's personal board of directors, but not from a networking sense, from a caring sense. And that was when I began the series of fMRI studies and hormonal studies. Now, I've done 3 of the fMRI studies directly, and 2 of my former doctoral students, Anita Howard and Angela Passarelli, did the hormonal studies. But what all of this tells us, coming full circle around to helping, is that within the range of most things that we encounter in our family life, our leisure, and at work, we often try to help people by trying to fix them. We can see what they're doing wrong. We can see what they should try. So we give them constructive criticism. We give them tips. We tell them how to change. Or, in an employment situation, maybe we even threaten them. And not many people change in a sustainable way. So I formed this study group at Case, Western Reserve University, of doctoral students and faculty, and ended up, having a number of key people. Scott Taylor is now at Babson, Anita Howard, as I said, Angela Passarelli is at college in Charleston. But Melvin Smith had joined our faculty, and he and I started working on the key part of my theory are these tipping points, these positive emotional attractors versus negative, enable a person to move into a particular space. Now, this positive emotional attractor is being in the hormonal system called the parasympathetic, the actual system that ameliorates stress, and being in the empathic or default mode network in the brain, and just having positive thoughts. And what is clear from medical research is that when you're in that state, you're open to new ideas and people. That the alternate state, which I call the negative emotional attractor, is a stress state. Could be mild to extreme, but the human organism becomes defensive. You go into an analytic task mode. In your brain, you go into a hormonal system where you're defending. And all of that results in, even at an annoying level of stress, results in closing a person down cognitively and perceptually and emotionally. So, Melvin and I, Melvin Smith and I, one of our professors at Case and co-authors on this book, in a burst of insight in 2003, started calling one coaching with compassion and the other coaching for compliance. And the shorthand means that when you coach with compassion, you coach to the other person's desires, their values, their dreams. When you coach for compliance, you're trying to help the other person become what you want them to become. And while that might be well-intended, it really doesn't work because on the whole, it feels like another form of being bullied or kind of intellectual imperialism. And that's what we started to see at all sorts of levels. And even in these fMRI studies we did, 30 minutes of talking about a person's dreams versus 30 minutes of talking about problems they're running into had dramatic effects in how their brains were activated, 5 days later. Here's a key question we often ask for this. If your life were fantastic, absolutely perfect, 10 to 15 years from now, what would it be like? And we always say life because we want it bigger than just work. And we always say 10 to 15 years because we don't want people forecasting. And we always emphasize ideal, absolutely perfect, to help them suspend reality. That activates parts of the brain that helps them with the right hormonal system that increases the functioning of their immune system, but also makes them more open to new ideas and other people.
Richard, let me ask you a question about that. Now, the idea behind it is something I use in my own coaching practice, and so it resonates for me. But I think people listening might wonder, well, I have no idea, right? I have no idea 10 to 15 years out what would be ideal for me. I've never really thought about that before. So how do you move people past that initial reaction to that kind of question, which says, 10 to 15 years out, geez, I don't know what I'm doing tomorrow. I have to look at my calendar.
No, and that's a good place, because what you don't want people to do is to give you a canned response. Because if they give you a canned response, it's almost always obligatory. They're actually giving you not the ideal self, but the ought self. They're giving you what other people are saying they should do.
Okay.
So you start out by saying, look, money's no object. You just won a Powerball and you had 80 to 100 million after tax.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
What would you love to be doing? Where? With whom? Now, there are some ways you can kind of help a person develop it, but the idea is to tap into their dreams. And honestly, most people don't have any trouble getting there. A lot of times they feel a little awkward at first, but then if you just pause and say, look, suppose everything were great, and money wasn't an issue, what would you do? And 80% of the people, because I have 100 graduate students every year who do this as a part of their training in my leadership course with strangers. And, these folks, some of them are physicians, but most of them are naive to being an effective coach. And all of a sudden, they're finding people open up about things that, even if they've known the person for a while, they never really knew about them. So it's not as hard as you would think. And the fact is that you don't want people to say, well, I know what I'd be doing, because that's forecasting. And almost everybody forecasts from a defensive posture.
Let me ask you about part of your book where you talk about reflective exercises, because again, one of the ways I think that you at least for me, you made this come alive was, you ask people to take a look at their values, and then
right.
And then you create a flip chart, and people go, and then if you've got a group of people go around and start looking at what people say is important to them and the way that they think about themselves in the future, and all of a sudden you realize that people that you may have known for years, you had no idea what their dreams were about, and some of the things that they cared most about. That's fascinating to me.
Yeah, so part of in our model of the ideal self, one of the things we tap into is your values and your operating philosophy, is how you determine value. Because very often people come at values, the reason that values don't have a very good correlation with behavior is because you will manifest or enact your values in a different way depending on your operating philosophy. So we get people to look at those things. We get them to look at their life and career stages. That also affects how you look at this whole thing of life. We ask people, one of the exercises is, you're relieved of all responsibilities for 2 years, and we can put you into a machine that magically gives you all the talent and skills you need to be great at whatever it is you're going to do. Name 3 jobs you'd love to do for, a year or two. The lottery question is a good one. What we now can call the bucket list. What are things you want to experience before you die? Even there, we ask for 27 things because we don't want people to give us 5 to 8. We want a lot more detail.
Well, let me ask you a key question, I think, for people that are listening that may want to buy your book, in terms of what do you hope people learn when they're finished with your book? And I know that the book is really, a lot of it seems like it's related to people that do coaching, that might be an executive coach, a life coach, it might be a coach, a career coach, or even a basketball coach, or some other form of sport or music.
We wrote the book for people that do any helping. So
that's what I wanted to say. Yeah, I wanted you to talk about that. Right.
Part of our target with a number of the examples are physicians and nurses. Part of it's parenting.
Mm-hmm.
So the applicability of this is at a very wide range of people who have a concern about helping motivate somebody else to learn or change. One takeaway is the sense of hope that you actually can do it. Another takeaway is it's probably not the way you've been approaching it. And instead of pulling to what should fix somebody, which we think is the coaching for compliance and turns people off, we're saying, do the thing that sometimes feels a little counterintuitive. Talk to them about what they would love to do. I mean, let me use an example from the book. One of the executives in the MBA program, and this is like 16 years ago, Darrell Gresham. I have permission to use the story. And Darrell was the VP of IT for a mid-sized company in the Cleveland area. And he had a small IT consulting practice on the side and another small IT service provider that they would recruit people to fill IT jobs.
And IT is information technology.
Information technology,
right.
computer stuff,
right.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
And Darrell writes his personal vision essay in my course all about promise keepers. Being an African-American father, he felt strongly, and it was a part of this movement, national movement of African-American men predominantly, to have men keep their promise when they get married or form a partnership or have children. And the promise is to stay with that other person and help them. But he didn't talk about his work. And I thought that was a little odd. I mean, sometimes people get very involved with their spiritual work or their nonprofit work, but hardly ever do I see an entire essay devoted to the person's social cause. So I'm sitting down for my kind of coaching session with him afterwards, and I'm saying, I wrote a note on his paper, and I said, Darrell, you didn't mention work at all, so I'm assuming you must have a huge trust fund. And he, of course, laughed and said no. So we sat down, and I said, I did, what I usually do. I said, let's talk about what you'd love to have happen out of life. And, I go through the different exercises that he prepared, and I'm not getting very far. And, mostly I said, look, what would you, if money were no object, what would you love to do? He said, drive a truck across the country. Because he had been a truck driver at one point in his younger years. But drive a truck. And now I'm listening to that, and I'm saying, here's a guy that's powerful, capable, charming, really smart. Like, this guy does not want to drive a truck. This is an escape fantasy. So I keep kind of trying to go at it in different ways. And, we're almost 40 minutes into this session, and I'm not getting anywhere. So finally I said, okay. I knew he liked single malt scotches. I said, Darrell, you've just had a fantastic week. You get home, it's Friday night, you take off your shoes, you put on some music you like, and you pour yourself, 2-3 fingers of your favorite single malt scotch, and you sit down on your couch. And I could see him visualizing this, okay, which was really important because he started to smile.
Right.
And I said, and as you bring the scotch up to your lips to take your first sip, you're feeling great because it has been a fantastic week. And so he's smiling at this point. And I'm saying, okay, why was it a fantastic week? What'd you do? And he said, without missing a beat, he said, I helped a whole bunch of teenagers realize that computers were their way to the future. And I said, tell me more. And it was like opening a fire hose. He started talking about, a lot of the kids he grew up with in East Cleveland who didn't make it out. They ended up either in prison or dead. Some made it out like him, but he was part of a smaller number of them. And he felt he had a very great lifestyle and was contributing in many ways. And he wanted to bring this message about the use of computers. It wasn't that computers and all this information technology was geeky stuff and uncool. It was, in fact, quite the opposite. So I get to this, a few minutes later, I say, well, so why don't you do some of that? And he kind of smiled, and he embarrassingly says, I like all this stuff. And he holds up his very expensive wristwatch and other things. And he said, my ex-wife, I have a good relationship with her, and I'm, helping to sock a lot of money away. So my daughter's about to start college soon. Go through that with my lawyers. I said, okay.
And here, all of a sudden, what I'm hearing is this guy has a dream, but he sees an obstacle to it. So all I said was, suppose you don't do it as a full-time thing. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, look, if you took one Saturday a month and went to Shaw High School, which is the high school he went to, I said, and did a workshop for any of the kids in high school on using computers. I said, or suppose you did every Friday morning, a half day, 3-hour workshop. Would it interfere with your performance in your main job or your two side companies? He said, no, not at all. He said, actually, I think people would appreciate the fact that, they had a little bit of a break from me. I said, so, and he just was beaming at this point. A few months later, after he graduated from the program, he calls me and says, by the way, I want to tell you how fast this thing happened. I've been chatting about this with a few colleagues, and I've now asked to do a course at the really major community college in the Cleveland area, Cuyahoga Community College at Tri-C. And he did that for a number of years and started doing these other kind of workshops. And even today that he works now not in IT but in distribution for an international company, he's single-handedly created a mentorship program in the company informally. Nothing to do with HR. He just finds people, young people who are newly hired, and he starts talking with them on a regular basis. And part of what he's very excited about is they're not all on the technical side anymore. And he said, and a few years ago, he told me this recently, he said a few years ago, it became clear that, it was all sorts of people, white and black, male and female, that were seeking me out for this advice. So here's an example of somebody who had a very important dream. He had some phenomenal talent, and he enjoyed doing that, but he also wanted to be able to give back in some bigger way. And it took a very odd set of questions to get him out of his way of thinking about his life and what was important to him. If anywhere along the way I had started with, I think you should do this for this reason, he probably wouldn't have gotten there. So part of the second message or the third message I think we have in this book is that most of the time when you try to help people, you're turning them off because you're really doing coaching for compliance. And that's why in the book, we spend a lot of time with exercises, reflective exercises. We have discussion guides about trying to help people realize that part of it starts with listening, something that you're phenomenal at, Chuck.
Thank you.
And pulling out what a person is saying. Part of it's talking about this wide spectrum, more holistic. What are your beliefs? What are your dreams? And we're not contending that everybody should become a social worker or a therapist. But we are saying that this is the kind of conversation decades ago you'd have with close friends. But we don't have time for friends anymore. And we confuse Facebook friends with friends. So what we're actually saying is the process is very, very basically human and respectful. But we become so instrumental in our ways of thinking. And, in fact, in today's day and age, all around the world, unbelievably narcissistic. And with all of these metrics and goals and dashboards and the preponderance of organizational life, for-profit, not-for-profit, of budgets and financials, all of that stuff activates the negative emotional attractor. All of those things close a person down to new ideas and hope. So it's not surprising that we have this worldwide motivational crisis with engagement numbers being at record lows. And we think that if people started to play around with, I'm not saying you have to have some conversion experience, just start to explore in non-threatening ways with people that you have a good relationship with, talking about their dreams, talking about their values, talking about things that would enable them to kind of find and then satisfy a deeper sense of purpose, a noble purpose, if you will, that what will happen is you'll start to find you're opening up people to their possibilities.
And I would encourage you all to buy the book. When is it going to be available, and where can people purchase it?
It's called Helping People Change. It is currently available for pre-orders on Amazon. Somebody told me recently that you could also pre-order it through Barnes & Noble. Pre-order it, you'd be able to get it sometime in mid to late August.
And could you also tell us a little bit about the two other authors that are part of the experience?
Yes, Melvin Smith and Ellen Van Osten are both professors at Case Western Reserve in the Department of Organizational Behavior. Melvin came to us from the University of Pittsburgh, but before he got his PhD, he had a career in marketing for Pepsi and a few other large companies. And he started focusing his work on social capital, but then quickly got into using these techniques. And he and I have probably done a lot of, probably more than anybody, writing together and academic and practitioner stuff since 2003 about these dynamics. And he is the faculty director of executive education as well as teaching in our more advanced graduate programs, Masters of OD and EMBA. Ellen, I got to know in the early 90s when she was in her MBA program. At that point, she was an engineer for General Electric, and then went into sales and marketing at Cole, and then ended up joining the staff at Weatherhead at the University of Case, and in the mid-90s, and headed up our corporate education actions, and eventually decided to succumb and got her PhD, and worked on competencies and coaching, which she loves and has always been doing. And she's director of our coaching research lab. Ellen had the distinction of helping our law school and our engineering school use this process in this course and integrate it into their program. So she's quite innovative in helping to spread the word. And 5 years ago, we decided to do a MOOC. I think there are about 135,000 people who have taken it.
And you want to say what a MOOC is? I know it's a lot.
A MOOC is a massive open online course. It's through Coursera. It's free for now 7 days. And ours has 15 these 10-minute videos and a bunch of exercises and readings and all around advanced coaching or helping topics. But it also became clear to us that I, as you had mentioned, I've written, over 200 academic articles and, 50 or 60 practitioner, but of my 9 books, 3 of them were practitioner books. And I just don't like writing a practitioner book until there's a good body of research that, is the foundation for what we're about to say. So Ellen and Melvin, were saying, okay, from about 2010 onward, are we ready to write this book? But it wasn't until we finished these physiological studies, the fMRI studies and the other hormonal studies, that I finally said, okay, I think we have it now. I think we're on sound evidence to say it isn't just somebody saying, oh, well, this is how I help people find a new path, or, some of these self-help gurus who are great at marketing, but, it's not clear that there's anything underneath it. And I think that becomes important because, there are all sorts of little things. Like, one of the things that our research has helped us to see is that goal setting, if you start it too soon or get too specific, interferes with the development process. And in fact, we have one of our chapters is called Dreams, Not Goals, because although goals may have a place for some people, for a lot of people, they actually close you down or you get defensive about it, whereas the dreams opens you up. We wouldn't have known that if we hadn't done some of these research studies. And, we would have fallen into the same rat race of thinking more metrics and more dashboards and more SMART goals help motivate people and change. And now we know it doesn't.
Well, one of the
useful.
things I want to say, Richard, is that I just think back to when you first started the interview today, and talked a little bit about when you first thought maybe I'll do something different, and the managers that we have all look like Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory in your experience, but you wanted to become a manager, but instead what you've done is think of the thousands, hundreds of thousands maybe of managers that you've actually influenced over these years, so that people are able to do better at engagement, and certainly the numbers in engagement aren't anything to do with the work that you're doing. You're helping to offset that, I'm sure. And I really appreciate your time today and the time you took with me. I do want to ask you just comment about one other thing, because about this work at Harvard that's trying to figure out how do we stop people from that addictive feeling of I've got to know what's going on with my phone when any kind of notification happens. And I just want to share a story, because sometimes often when you want to change behavior, it takes quite some time, but every once in a while there's a moment where just something clicks with someone. And I want to share a story that really changed me. It was a lot of years ago. I was working for Exxon at the time in leadership development, and they had us all, everybody was supposed to go and see this Texas Ranger that was going to talk to us about the importance of wearing seatbelts. And back then I felt kind of invincible, and I was younger, and I thought, well, seatbelts, you might get stuck in the car if you got in an accident. And I wasn't buying it. And I was, stupid actually about it, but this was the feeling I had at the time. I went and I saw this presentation, and there's this big, burly, strong, very tall, muscular Texas Ranger standing in front of us. And he said, look, I know I can't say anything to you that's going to change whether or not you use a seatbelt or not, but I want to show you a few pictures of the bodies of the people I picked out of their cars who weren't wearing the seatbelts. And he proceeded to show us some very gruesome pictures of accidents, and there was pictures of him helping to remove people that were mangled and dead. And he was crying when he told us this story. And I got to tell you, from that day forward, I've never driven without a seatbelt. And I'm hoping that people listening to this, make the same distinction around smartphones, because the evidence says that there's a lot more people hitting pedestrians and bicyclists and motorcycles and banging into cars in front of them because of this distracted driving.
Here's the dilemma. The dilemma. If all you do is try to scare people, you end up with poor treatment adherence, which is what the mistake most physicians make, or nurses.
Right.
They try to say, well, if you don't take your medicine, don't exercise, this and that, you're going to have your feet amputated and all these things. So the gruesome pictures doesn't work. It didn't work with you.
No, but what worked with me was this person crying who actually had the evidence. It was the compassionate piece of it that worked, not the compliance piece. Right.
What struck you was a person who had a lot of features that you admired, and yet he spoke from his heart. There was a genuineness to it. And then he actually spoke about the pain and the sadness of losing these people. So I would contend it was the person and the emotional appeal that actually struck a note and got you to consider this.
Absolutely.
But the sustainability had to be helped by something or somebody else later. Because the problem is, most of the time we think we can scare people straight.
Right, and it doesn't work, I know.
And it doesn't work, as anybody who's raised teenagers knows.
Absolutely.
But there is something very, very powerful about human beings talking honestly and emotionally to each other. And that degree of authenticity it ends up being the kind of thing that really can come across and help people have a different kind of experience, and to look for ways that there might be positive things to aspire to. I mean, I knew when I was treating alcoholics, if all they had to do was stay sober, they'd be back drinking in 6 months. Mm-hmm. They had to stay sober, but they needed a bigger reason than that.
Right.
It's just too hard. So the issue is that it's not as simple as a one-point intervention. And, I mean, it was even showed with AIDS prevention, even in sub-Saharan Africa, that giving people instruction about it didn't work. That the only things occasionally that helped were programs that involved a lot of role-playing and exercises and assignments and things that go out and talk to people in their neighborhoods about and then come back and talk about. So there's something very powerful about the emotional conversation. And by the way, social media isn't that. Social media is very analytic, whether it's texting or emailing or Facebook or whatever. And as a result, we now have the neurological evidence to show that people who do it more get more depressed because they're more distant from other people and these human conversations.
Well, to me, it was the emotional contagion. You're right. There was the empathic feeling coming from that trooper of what he experienced, right. And I just felt it the way he was talking about it. And I'm hoping in sharing that people who are listening feel it too, and are smarter about what they do when they're out there driving. So. Well, listen, I've come to the end of my time here, so I wanted to thank you. And again, I want to encourage people to buy Richard's book, See People Change. You also had a little bit of other words surrounding the title. I'll give you a second just to talk about that, too.
Well, the subtitle is Coaching with Compassion for Lifelong Learning and Growth. We want to encourage people to try to reach out and help others by focusing on them, on the other person. And that's the Coaching with Compassion. And we believe that the research data support that the durability, that's why we're talking about lifelong learning and growth, is huge compared to typical approaches to try to help people or reach out to them.
Well, I think it comes across very, very clear, and that, no matter who you are, you don't have to be a leader, you don't have to be somebody in charge of someone else, you don't even have to be a parent. You can just be someone who cares about others, and you can be somehow, some way involved in coaching, and everybody who picks your book up is going to learn something, not only of value to helping them help others. I think there's a lot in there to help yourself as well.
That's a part of stepping out of the narcissism is, to say, look, the most natural thing you can do to make the world a better place is care for somebody else.
I think that's a great way to end. Richard, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Good. Thank you, Chuck.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.